Okay, folks, so this is a chart for Melania Trump, Donald Trump, their relationship, and the smackdown heard around the world, starting with a slap that was heard across the world. Anyway, so let's take a look at the players that we have. Now, all of this has been inspired by the very public and very inappropriate uh, power play between Mrs. Trump and her husband on November 13th, 2018, wherein she demands the termination of a deputy chief national security advisor for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with this woman's competence at her job as a deputy chief national security advisor, but because Princess got her panties in a twist and doesn't like her. Oh my God, our country is being run by the mean girls out of the movie from Hollywood. Anyway, so as you can tell, I'm not particularly pleased with this, as I'm sure a lot of people in the country aren't. Because no matter how much you don't like people, these people are responsible for our safety, not your personal comfort, Princess, but our safety. Whew, okay, so let's see what we got here. All right, let me get rid of that. Yes, there we go. So let me enlarge this. So let's take a look at Melania. As a matter of fact, let me pull up her individual charts separate from this. So we don't have a birth time for her. So what we have to do, there we go, is work without it. So we're just working with planets and signs. We disregard the houses because we don't actually know where these are without a time of birth. So Melania was born on April 26, 1970 in Novo Mesto, Slovenia. She is a Taurus with a moon in Capricorn. She has Mercury and Venus in Taurus. She has Saturn in Taurus, Mars in Gemini, Uranus in Libra, Jupiter's in Scorpio, and Neptune in Sag at 0, by the way, and Pluto at 25 Virgo. So the first thing I'm going to draw your attention to is this preponderance of earth sign placements, right? So look at this. So right here, we've got a grand trine in Earth. This tells us right off the top that materialism, heavy-handed materialism, is a big theme in her life. And while she could theoretically be good at making money, since that would be the primary focus of everything she does, material comfort and abundance, notice, we've talked about this before, notice this really unfortunate placement of Saturn in Taurus. Because guess who else has Saturn in Taurus? That's right, Mr. Matt Whitaker. And Saturn in Taurus has a tremendous fear, of poverty. So they really hate letting go of anything they get their grubby little hands on. Now, there are some Saturn and Taurus people who are very enlightened and get it and understand what it means or what it could mean to go hungry and be homeless, and are wellsprings of compassion and charity. But unless you see evidence to that, do not for a minute think that these people are going to be motivated by any altruism when it comes to anything they can get their hands on. Saturn in Taurus is a very sticky position. And like Cancer, it does not like to let go. It's a hoarder placement. With the Saturn conjuncting the Sun in her chart and making this grand trine in Earth, it's going to make her very heavily materialistic. The other thing is that with that moon in Capricorn, this emphasizes the material side of the moon in Capricorn. It's a very unfortunate placement. Because moon in Capricorn typically is known for being driven by pragmatic consideration. It is the placement of the prostitute because everything is a business transaction. So it's literally what you can do for me and quid pro quo sort of arrangements. Rarely will you see a moon in Capricorn that is enlightened and operating from more charitable positions. It happens, but it literally tends to be one extreme or the other. So you have saints or sinners here. And it goes for men and women. Don't kid yourself. Men with Moon in Capricorn are just as much capable of prostituting themselves and literally um, saving themselves and their affections for the highest bidder, as the case with Mr. Matt Whitaker, um, as anybody else is. So it's not a happy placement. These people are so uh, identify so much with material things that sometimes it's hard for them to see any other good in relationships or people. So they tend to do well in life. Once they're married, they won't get divorced unless, and if they do, God forbid, because they will take everything with them. You will be lucky if you have a shirt left on your back. But as a rule, once married, it tends to stay married because they like routine and predictability. So there's that. Now, she has Mercury in Taurus, conjunct Venus in Taurus, which should give her a nice speaking voice, which she does have a nice speaking voice. It is trine Pluto. So again, Mercury and Venus trine Pluto. This is somebody who operates with an end goal or outcome in mind. She is one of these girls or boys. She's one of these folks who always has an agenda and is always looking for what they can get out of you and what you have available to them. So she would make a phenomenal salesperson because she would be able to spot instantly who's got the deepest pockets to make the biggest purchases and be able to wrangle that out of them. But for personal relationships, it's a little more complicated. Although I suppose if you're Trump with that kind of bankroll and that little else to offer, it wouldn't really matter. Um, mm. And these are the people running our country. Anyway, okay. Sorry. Now, she has Mars in Gemini. Mars in Gemini tends to be, oh, this is interesting. And it's trying Uranus. So here's what I'm going to tell you. Normally, we don't ever assume that we can spot sexual orientation or preference in a chart because you can't. It's just not reliable. So you can't run around looking at charts and saying, oh, well, you're clearly this, blah, blah, blah. Because 99% of the time, you're going to be wrong. Sexuality is a much, much different thing than all of the other things that make up your personal evolution. But here is what I will say about this particular chart. With all this Taurus in her chart and this grand trine in Earth and that moon in Capricorn, here's the thing. She's very much about her physical comforts. She likes what feels good to her. She is a big pillow princess. She's the doomy queen. So with that in mind, these people, as a rule, generally tend to be not too particularly picky about who's providing them pleasure, as long as it feels good to them, which is good and bad. It's good because they're capable of deriving pleasure from pretty much almost any situation, and that's a good thing, right? Because pleasure is hard to come by in life. You got to get it where you can get it. The downside is that, with that said, their loyalty is not necessarily based on any particular skill, talent, or ingenuity that you might have in terms of providing them pleasure, because you're replaceable. Like literally, it's you, the comfy bed, the hot chocolate. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that will bring these people pleasure. You're not the sole source of that. So for folks who are who believe that holding out their affections for someone who's going to appreciate the gifts and genius that they bring to the intimate part of adult life, people with these particular types of configurations are not your best bet. Not only will they wear you out, they will also replace you very quickly when you are worn out, because you're not their only source of pleasure in life. They're capable of deriving pleasure from pretty much everything. So I'm only saying all of this because I'm incredibly jealous. I wish I could do that. Anyway. With Mars in Gemini, so here's where it gets juicy. With Mars in Gemini tends to be very mental or cerebral. So again, we've got this idea that there's not a lot of social or emotional investment in pleasure. And most of it's mental. Mars in Gemini, as a rule, not always, so don't make this a golden standard to measure by, but as a rule, a general rule, a loose rule, Mars in Gemini tends to be more invested in things that allow them to have lots and lots of alternate stimulation. So they like hands and mouths and dirty talk and whispering and eyes and things like everywhere all at once. So the more of a three-ring circus juggling act you can turn your um, activities into, the more entertained and happy they are. Now, the thing about it is Gemini is an air sign and they don't like being smothered. And here's why we come to this particular conclusion. And that is that Gemini does not like being smothered. It's an air sign. So this whole, one-on-one sweaty body struggling for air with 400 pounds on top of you, like suffocating you, it's not their thing. They need to be able to breathe. They want to be able to see and hear and touch and taste. They need space to move. Which also typically lends itself to non-heteronormative relationships because different physical configurations because of body designs. So with Mars in Gemini, and it's trining Uranus in Libra. So Uranus in Libra Uranus as a rule tends to be more experimental and open-minded. Uranus is in an air sign and it's in Libra. So Uranus in Libra grooves to its own ideas about what beauty is. And they're very much attracted to beauty, but also more than that, they're attracted to unusual things, right? So here you have Mars, which represents our sexuality or our expression of sexuality, one of the many different ways we express our sensuality. And there are many in a chart. Trining the planet of experimentation. So in this chart with a man or a woman, one of the things that I would expect to find if I knew them intimately, is someone who likes multiple forms of stimulation, does not like heavy, cloying, like body pressed on body sort of stuff. They need a little bit of space and room to move and breathe because they don't like being suffocated. And also with Uranus and Libra trining that Mars, I would expect to see somebody who's a lot more open-minded and maybe very interested in electronics, or more open types of relationships with additional people, or unconventional, non-traditional partnerings with folks that people wouldn't normally expect to see them with, So there's a whole lot of interesting stuff going on here with her that would certainly make Mr. Trump not her be-all, end-all source of entertainment and pleasure for herself. So now I'm really starting to wonder. Oh, I almost forgot. Mars in Gemini also doesn't do heavy, cloying, emotional relationships either. They are the kings and queens of one-night stands. So because they're not attached, they're just not, they don't like being smothered mentally, emotionally, physically. They need space and air. They don't like being tied down or anchored to somebody else's issues. So they're perfectly capable of enjoying themselves immensely, thinking you're wonderful, and then forgetting your name 5 minutes later. So this is this is our first lady. Which isn't to say that any of this is a bad thing. I'm just saying, like with this particular chart, when it comes to being someone who's capable of having easygoing relationships where she's not heavily invested in the outcome, as long as she's getting what she wants out of it, she's good. She is solid. So now with this configuration, now that I look at it, I'm really starting to wonder which one of her aides might be operating as a part-time plaything. But I know it's very inappropriate to say, but I'm telling you with this wheel. All right, so now, so the other thing, now at this point, we look at this and we're like, okay, well, what are the connections between her and her husband? Because clearly there has to be something for them to have gotten together in the first place, other than her suspected bisexuality. Oh, yeah, I did say that. I did say that. So the first thing typically I would look for successful long-term situations are Jupiter contacts, right? So we know with him, his Jupiter is, where is his Jupiter? It's right here. Fix that. So Jupiter, his Jupiter is at 17 Libra, okay? So does she have anything around those degrees? Well, nothing. The only thing she has close is the part of fortune at 18 Aries opposing him. It's kind of a weak contact. We can certainly use it, but for a marriage, we would like to see more. So the next thing we look at are the lights, the sun and the moon. Well, his sun and his moon, we've got him at 2122 Sag Gemini, right? So we're going to look for things also in her chart at 2122, as far back as 17 Gemini, in Gemini and Sagittarius. Well, we've got nothing. The closest thing we have for her is Mars at 5 and Neptune at 0. That is not close enough to show a strong, loving contact between charts. They're not interacting with each other. So the next thing we know is, well, what else do we have at these degrees, right? Well, the next dynamic contact we have at those degrees, we can't use that because it's an inconjunct. The only thing we have is Pluto at 25 Virgo. So her Pluto sits right here, making a T-square to his full moon. So we don't have any contacts to his lights. The only aspect Jupiter makes is an opposition to her part of fortune, right? And all we have is her Pluto making a T-square to his full moon in his chart. Well, that's pretty interesting, and that's pretty telling, because Pluto has a lot of rulerships that include the underworld and mafia, as well as big business and criminal organizations, and things that happen under or behind the light. These are things that happen in shadows. So there's some suggestion that there's a lot of Plutonian themes in their relationship. So I'm curious what the exact nature of their relationship is, or what it has become. One of the things to understand is that no matter what you see in a chart, that person may not be there yet. Everything in the chart is something unfolding or developing across a lifetime. So what you see in a chart today may not manifest or become part of their nature or their experience until much later, and sometimes not at all. You know, unrealized potential is not unusual in this lifetime. So try to avoid getting this thing where you jump to conclusions and you say, oh, well, you're obviously blah, 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 because it says so in this chart. So even now when I'm making jokes about her being bisexual, well, kind of sort of jokes, it is entirely possible that she has not realized that potential within herself. So the potential may be there looking at a chart, but she may not have realized that yet. So we cannot run around automatically assuming that these things are de facto existing, which includes this Pluto in the T-square with his sun moon. She may have gotten involved with him, and that Pluto may not have been realized yet. That Pluto, that underground, underworld criminal involvement, may not have manifested through her or from her into his life and that marriage until after they were married, or well after they were married, or maybe not even, maybe it hasn't happened yet. We don't know. What we do know about Pluto, though, is that once Pluto gets its hooks in you, because it is the lord of the underworld, and it is the kidnapper who took Persephone and held her hostage, and then even after returning her, refused to let her go and negotiated 6 months of captivity for 6 months of freedom, because Pluto. You know, once Pluto gets its hooks into you in a relationship, it's not going to let you go. So she's not letting him go anywhere. Well, at least not until she's done with him, and even then she's taking the better parts of him, which unfortunately for him is only his money. All right, so that's that. Now, are there any other contacts in this chart? Good Lord, there has to be something happy, right? So we're looking at this heavy Taurus placement in her chart. I mean, good Lord, if she had any more Taurus in her chart, I don't know how I don't know how she'd get out of bed. Her behind would be so freaking heavy and gravity bound. So, okay, well, maybe there's something here with this Taurus, right? So we're looking at his chart. Are we seeing anything? Not a whole lot. So that's a quincunx. That's a semi-sextile. Give her that. Can't use that. This is a quincunx. We can't use that. Well, and these are too early. So the only thing that is left as far as contacts between these two charts becomes all of these Cancer planets making a sextile, right? And look at this. His Mars making a square to those Taurus planets. So here's the thing, right? A sextile is a weak aspect. It's a good aspect, but it's a weak aspect. It's not a compelling aspect. So that sextile, while it's very supportive and would make it a reasonably comfortable relationship with each other, I mean, after all, the man has Mercury and Saturn conjunct. He is very much, and it's in Cancer. He doesn't let go of anything either. Or, I'm sorry, it's Venus. Venus and Saturn conjunct in Cancer. Um, so Cancer, but as a sign, also does not like to let go of things. Venus and Saturn together is the sign of prostitutes, or the placement of prostitutes. Again, the idea of quid pro quo, transactional relationships. What can you do for me in exchange for this? This is how we define it. So with that Venus Saturn together in Cancer, he would very much, A, be very comfortable with those types of relationships, and B, this 11th house would also rule his third marriage, which would be her. So maybe those stories about her being an escort are true. So Venus Saturn, with her moon and cap and all that Taurus in her chart, he's very comfortable with how she does her thing. The problem is that Mars in Leo squares all these Taurus planets. And Mars, even though his Mars is very weak, Mars will still override and run roughshod over weak, smaller planets, which in this case would be her Mercury and her Venus and her Saturn, but specifically her Mercury and her Venus. So everything about his way of expressing his masculine nature goes against, let me put it out here for you, goes against one, how she communicates and how she feels about the world, and the other, her relationship style. So she likes to see herself as very light and very socially graceful. And remember, she doesn't like to be suffocated. So she needs a lot of air around her, right? And that Mars in Leo wants everything all the time, me, 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 me. So Mars in Leo is very selfish and very heavy-handed, and it tends to just steamroll right over that Mercury Venus. So she finds him, or would find him, difficult to spend time with, which makes it even more curious, even in spite of this sextile, even in spite of this, which makes it very curious how she ended up married to him, much less married to him for so long, and what her motivations were. Although we're pretty good about what her motivations are. That's established. So across the charts, we are not seeing any compelling contacts between these two. We're seeing a lot of temperamental similarities, which also goes a long way in a marriage. But in terms of day-to-day operations, this is not a happy arrangement. And the strongest, most compelling, important contact that we see between these charts is her Pluto squaring the full moon in his chart. That Pluto, that says everything. There's a lot going on in there, and that's worth watching. This relationship is worth watching, and we're spending too much time looking at him and not enough time watching her, because that Pluto is a very behind the scenes planet. So it does all its dirty work behind the curtain where nobody can see. So I would keep my eye on her. There's more here than meets the eye, because this is not a love marriage. And even money aside, that Pluto contact makes this arrangement, which is what the marriage is. The marriage is an arrangement. This makes this particular arrangement a lot more suspicion worthy than other marriages would be. So there's that. All right. So even if that Pluto has not manifested in a relationship yet, at some point it will, because that's what the chart is. It is an unfoldment of potential. All right, so now let's go to November 13th, 2018, when Mira Ricardel was publicly demanded to be fired because Princess didn't like her. And the president wasn't interested in her personal petty issues. So naturally she had to take this public. Dear God in heaven. All right, so now we're going to look at the aspects for the day and try to see what was going on. We're not worried about him so much. We're actually really curious about what was going on with her that would drive this type of hubris, right? So the first thing I want you guys to see is she's got transiting Jupiter, look at this, right here on her natal Neptune. Now remember when we talked about Jupiter entering Sagittarius, for those of you who got that horoscope for the year, Jupiter entering Sagittarius will also simultaneously be moving into a square with Neptune. So it's not here yet, but it's definitely conjuncting hers. And anytime you get a Jupiter-Neptune not connection, that's what I'm looking for. Anytime you get a Jupiter-Neptune connection, there's a real challenge with overstepping boundaries and knowing how far is too far, because Jupiter and Neptune both don't know when to quit. They just whoosh, 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 blow it up, blow it up, blow it up, blow it up until everything like explodes, right? So Jupiter was crossing her Neptune, increasing her unrealistic optimism about what was possible. And certainly she was way out of line with this business. All right, what else is going on that day? So the other thing, look at the Saturn, and this has been going on for a while, but it is almost exact right now, right? So Saturn, transiting Saturn's at 6 Capricorn. It is conjuncting her moon. Now, the thing about it is we don't know her birth time. Okay, so her moon could be anywhere from 3 Capricorn to 9 Capricorn, give or take, right? And 6 Capricorn, is going to fall somewhere in this range. So Saturn has been moving across that moon, either going across it or approaching it for a while now, ever since Saturn entered Capricorn. Now, Saturn going across your moon is not a happy position. If anything, Saturn going across your moon depresses the daylights out of you. The other thing is that Saturn going across your moon makes you painfully aware of your obligations in life, not your responsibilities, but your obligations. And anybody over the age of 30 will certainly tell you that there's a huge difference between what you're responsible for and what you're obligated for. These are the same but slightly different. So she's really feeling her obligations. And remember, she's got all this air in her chart, and she likes freedom of movement and space and not being responsible for stuff. And now all of a sudden, what is it? The shackles have been attached to her ankles, and she's feeling it. So Saturn has been all over this moon, while Jupiter has just now conjuncted her Neptune. So she's having all sorts of ideas about escape and rising to levels of autonomy, because the moon and Saturn is all about being at the top of the dog heap. That may not be realistic. So what else is going on this day? Well, the other thing that we're looking at in this particular transit chart down here, oops, sorry about that, is Mars. And the reason we're looking at that is because Mars is the planet of warfare and combat and challenges. So when you throw down the gauntlet, which she has done, where someone challenges you, which Trump has been, we look for Mars, because Mars is the thing that will drive that action. Now, Mars is very important here because it's at 2839 Aquarius, because in Trump's chart, in the Leo rising chart, they have 29. They want to believe it's 29 Leo rising with 29 Aquarius on the 7th house. The 7th house is always your marriage partner. So this Mars at 28 Aquarius would be his 7th house cusp. So Mars would be rising across that cusp, okay, of his spouse or his opponents, right? So that would be very telling. Now, typically with Mars crossing that 7th house, we would see more divorce-worthy actions. He's not going to divorce her for this. She owns him. I don't know what she's got on him, but she owns him. So that's not an option. So the other thing is that, and this is where we get into some business about the angles, right? So with the angles in a chart, the thing to understand is that the two most sensitive angles in a chart, and any astrologer tells you otherwise shouldn't be practicing astrology, It is the ascendant and the degree on the ascendant and the midhaven and the degree on the midhaven. This is why we use the time of birth. These angles, these two angles, are the most sensitive angles in a chart, and they are often used along with a few other things for timing events. That's why the time of birth is so important, because we want to get this angle exact, all right? Because that's how we time things. They're very sensitive. So when something crosses those angles, we should see some activity of import, right, occurring. So Mars at 28 means that if he is in fact Leo rising, I do not believe he is, but if he is in fact Leo rising, that means that this should be 28, not 29, because Mars, right? Mars was at 28 when this incident happened. This was an exceptional incident because this is just not done. And this was very public and this was very deliberate. And of all the crappy things she's pulled with him, and certainly with the image of his administration while she's been First Lady, this was literally a direct assault on his leadership and his manhood, and intended to be that way, because she's literally trying to show the world who's boss in this relationship and who has the final say about who stays and goes in that White House. So if that's the case, 28 Mars right here for this incident at 28 should be the degree on his ascendant if he's Leo rising. I do not believe he is Leo rising, and here it's why. Remember, the angles are very sensitive, so exact transits, exact things hitting those angles are what we are looking for, all right? If Mars is at 28 Aquarius and we adjust his ascendant to what I think it is, which is around 2 Virgo rising, all right, that also changes his midhaven, and it moves his midhaven to 28 degrees. Right? 28 degrees Taurus. Now, if his midhaven is 28 degrees Taurus, that means that this Mars now squares that midhaven. So it hits that sensitive angle. So you're probably thinking to yourself, like, well, okay, I'm sort of following you. I'm not completely sure what that means and why that's different. Well, here's the thing. Your ascendant is a very personal point. So things that happen to your ascendant or your ascendant degree are very personal. They're very direct because it's the physical body, the immediate self, and it's you physically. So it's a very personal thing, and personal things are not public things. So if this Mars at 28 Aquarius was in fact crossing a 28 Leo ascendant degree, he would have felt this. The confrontation would have existed, but it would not be so public. He would have felt it immediately and directly, but it would not be so publicly visible. Your midhaven, this degree up here, this is what the world sees. This is your public reputation. This is very publicly visible. Things that happen here are things that people outside of your personal life can see. Your wife, bitch slapping you in front of the entire globe and having that stuff all over the newspapers, and the nature of the conflict and the details of the conflict and the reasons for the conflict, all the information about the conflict. Literally, this is the equivalent of having a public fight with your spouse where everyone can hear all your dirty laundry. That is what you're going to get when Mars connects with that midhaven. In this particular case, it was a square. 28 Aquarius squares 28 Taurus. So the minute Mars came into that 7th house and hit this degree, not this one, but this one, okay, that's when it was a public showdown. And that's exactly what we got. So this would make sense. 28 Aquarius Mars, right, at a 28 degree Taurus midhaven. The other thing that makes sense about this, right, is look over here. Look what she's got at 28 Taurus. She's got Venus at 28 Taurus. So her Venus sits right there. So Mars on this day was squaring her Venus. She was really feeling herself and not in a happy way. And clearly relationships were an issue. All right. So it wasn't just a relationship with Mira Ricardel, it was also a relationship with Trump. And she acted in a very Mars way, Mars square Venus. Okay. Which for him became a very public showdown. And this is why I say this man has 2 degrees Virgo rising. All right. Now, this is not the first time she has done some less than ladylike things as the first lady with this man. So publicly humiliating him seems to be her thing in life. But more interesting and more important than that, she gets away with it. Like, this is stuff you should never be able to get away with your spouse in public when they're in this kind of position with the world, much less an entire country. And yet she gets away with it. I mean, it's just remarkable, this crap. So one of the things I want to take you back to is the very public display of slapping his hand away. Remember that? The slap heard round the world, where he tried to hold her hand on the tarmac. She literally, visibly slapped his hand away from her and made it clear she did not want him touching her. So in front of press reporters and everything. So now here's the thing about that. That was compared to this, that was a very private moment, because it wasn't like she really dramatically slapped him and made a face. It was a very small, discreet movement, but it was still very public and very clear. It just happened to be caught on camera. So I would take this back to that day and see what the transits were that day. Now, the report was May 23rd, 2017, but it occurred in Israel, which would have made it May 22nd, because they are, I believe, a day behind, or May 21st. But it was May 22nd in Tel Aviv when it happened. It was just reported here on a different day because of the time zone differences. So on that particular day, like, what was going on that might explain that, right? So again, the first thing we're going to look for is Mars, right? So here, Mars, in his chart, Mars was setting off this opposition in his chart, okay? Now, in her chart, with Mars at 21 Gemini, we're not really seeing anything except a square to that Pluto, which is part of that T-square. Now, remember, Pluto is very behind the scenes, behind the shadows, behind the curtains kind of activity. So with Mars squaring Pluto, transiting Mars squaring her Pluto, this would have been all very subversive. So this would not have been something intended for public consumption. With Mars setting off his full moon, he would have had a lot going on his plate anyway, but because of the connections with her Pluto to his full moon, that Mars activity would have definitely put strain on that relationship. So there was definitely some stuff going on. So the other things that we would look at in this chart, because we're looking for connections here, right? So maybe Venus, because Venus rules relationships. Well, what is Venus doing in here? Is Venus doing anything useful that would tell us anything about that day? So Venus is at 17 Aries. We don't really see anything. Oh, and by the way, we can't actually use the part of fortune because we don't have a time of birth. And this is all based on math calculations from time of birth. So with Venus, it's 17 Aries. We're not actually seeing anything in her chart. Nope. And are we seeing anything in his? Well, yes. So Venus at 17 Aries is opposing his Jupiter. What else do we have here? The Moon and Uranus are in late Aries. Maybe. So the Moon may have already gone into Taurus, or it may be back towards Uranus, but certainly close enough to that. With that Moon Uranus, put that Moon Uranus here. So that would also be involving his Mars, but is it doing anything in her chart? Well, no, not really. So he was having a very, very active day, and it was very important. Obviously, it was significant for him because for whatever reason, Israel is very important to him and his agenda. But we're talking about the hand slapping incident on tarmac. So we really want to look for aspects between the transits here and her chart. Okay, because we're trying to see what was activated in her chart that would have led to this. And we're not seeing a whole lot. So let's try her Mars. So her Mars is at 5 Gemini. Well, look at this. The sun was on her Mars. Okay. Mercury was at 7. Okay. So we've got the Mars here, and then Mercury was at 7 here. All right. And what else do we have? Neptune is in Pisces. It's not doing anything. Saturn's at 26 Sag. Right. So Saturn was here. Okay, Pluto's at 19, and then Jupiter's at 13. Which we can't really use. All right, so on the day of the hand slap heard round the world, so we have Mars here. Sorry, not this. This is the sun. We have the sun here lighting up her Mars. So this would have been really, she would have been really feeling herself very ballsy that day. And again, Gemini, they like space and air. So this sun would have lit up anything associated with her Mars. Okay. And Mars with Jupiter in her natal chart, this would have made her very optimistic or overreaching about what she is capable or entitled to do. And also more than a little desirous of some freedom and some air, which she probably wasn't getting. Mercury here was all over the Sun-Saturn. So with that, Mercury on the Sun-Saturn like that, there's a lot of thought. The thought processes tend to be focused on, in this particular case, not only the men in our life, but our concerns, our very real concerns and fears about our security. So there may have been some discussion. And again, we don't know because we're only privy to what the media gives us. So there may have been some discussion that really pushed her buttons where her insecurities were concerned and made her a much less than happy person those couple of days. Now, here's the kicker, right? Saturn at 26. Now, Saturn had been going across this degree for a couple of weeks, right? Because Pluto is at 25. So Saturn had been going across that Pluto for a couple of days. Saturn-Pluto squares are not fun. I mean, getting a root canal would probably be a lot more fun. So she's got a Saturn-Pluto square. So this is really getting into her worst fears, right? And her biggest concerns in life, which for her are pretty simple. It's basically financial security. And Mercury is right there communicating and putting her thoughts all over her fears, right? Saturn and the sun, you know, our ability to live in this world. So she was not feeling good. So we don't know what was going on in their personal relationship, but I can tell you that whatever this had a lot to do with her having a lot of deep insecurities being brought to the surface that clearly were not being dealt with in a way that made her feel better. So those insecurities would have come to the surface no matter what with these aspects, but based on her behavior that was accidentally caught on camera, this was not a pleasant conversation with her and her husband. And with him taking this transiting Mars across his sun in that full moon, he would have just been all about himself, because Mars and the sun tends to make us a little over assertive, and Mars opposing the moon tends to make us a little insensitive. So over assertive and insensitive are not great combinations for domestic harmony, as it were. So the other thing is we also want to look at, was there anything in this chart with him, because remember, we're talking about the difference between the ascendant and the midheaven. Was there anything in this chart with him that would have activated the angles? Because again, even though this was intended to be a very private, discrete moment between them, it was still caught on camera and made public. So there's something there that made this important. Also, this little ripple in their relationship, you can bet your sweet bippy that this is like a little puff of smoke on a volcano. There's some huge, because there's Pluto involved with her, there is some huge, huge stuff underneath the surface of that action. So there's a whole lot here, a whole lot more here than we're privy to. So if he has 28 or even 29 Leo rising, right? That we shouldn't have seen this, and this shouldn't have been a matter of public mockery, because at 28 or 29 Leo, all right, he had planets trining that. This should have been an excellent day. And look at this, right? A grand trine, no less, with Saturn, Uranus, the Moon and Venus, and his ascendant. Should have been a phenomenal day for him, and certainly he should have received a lot of leeway and protection, right? So that should have gone. That little incident should have gone pretty much unnoticed and unremarkable. Now, here's what I want you to also consider. If he is instead 2 Virgo rising, well, guess what? Look at this. The sun that day would have been squaring his ascendant. Okay? The sun has to do with things that are made public. All right. So while this was very much a relationship issue between them, it was made public, the sun, okay, as a result. And this is different from the midheaven because it was a very private moment between them that was accidentally caught on camera, which is very different. That just happened to be made public, right? Which is very different from a very public assault on his leadership and his manhood that was deliberately orchestrated so that the entire world knew the details and the ins and outs of what was going on and who was actually in charge in this relationship, and who had the most influence in terms of critical decisions, even when it came to matters of national security. And that, my friends, is the difference between the ascendant and the midheaven, and also a little bit of astrological I spy games when looking at our current administration and the leadership and the people in it. So I hope this has been enjoyable for you. I know this is a bit of a long, discussion here, but I'm so happy to finally have something recording my screens again, that I really wanted to share this with you. So interesting stuff. We'll get more into the synastry or the relationship of Melania and Donald later, but they're actually not very interesting. Again, the strongest, most dynamic contact between them is her Pluto making a T-square to his full moon, which to me indicates that this is an arranged marriage, and there are some less than savory elements or motivations for this marriage even existing. And we won't, again, it's Pluto, it's all behind the scenes, behind the curtain. We won't have access to that information unless the curtain is pulled back and it's revealed to us. So it's going to be very difficult to corroborate any of this. We would literally be playing speculation and guessing games. However, we will definitely take a look, I think, at some other relationships. More specifically, I'm more interested in Donald and Ivana's chart, Ivana Trump, the first wife. And we can sort of look at all three of them together. And I say Ivana because that was genuinely, gives all appearances of a love relationship. And granted, it's a love relationship between two raging narcissists. But there's a lid for every pot. And they appear to have genuinely loved each other on a very real level because they understood each other, which is very different from this calculated marriage. So I will be doing this marriage chart later. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please feel free to leave comments, like, subscribe, let me know what you'd like to see, and definitely let me know your thoughts or opinions on this particular marriage and these events. But don't you yell at me if you're one of these like Trump-loving conservatives. I don't want to hear it. There's 100,000 boards all over YouTube and everywhere else to start fights with people about that. You won't do it here. This is the safe haven for people who are not Trump lovers. So there you go. All right, folks. Talk to you later. Bye.